All right, so I'm going to get started now. So welcome and thank you for joining us for our fourth annual Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice in Environmental Data Science speaker series. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Eric Nost, our third speaker in this seminar series. I'm Christina Mancia, the Community Engagement Officer at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and I'm joined by the rest of the DEIJ Seminar Series Planning Committee. We have Amelia, Justin, Juliet, Erica, Monica, Mona, and Angie. At NCES, we work to accelerate scientific discoveries that enhance our understanding of the world and benefit people and nature, as well as transform the scientific culture to be more open, efficient, and collaborative. And for more information, you can check out the NCES website. Now, before I begin, we want to ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which NCES is located. We pay our respects to the Chumash peoples and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge that this land on which we live and work are the traditional homelands of indigenous peoples, including the Chumash peoples. This land today is the result of the erasures and exclusions of indigenous peoples. As we come together to bring awareness to issues of equity and inclusion, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. As we continue to work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in data science, we strive to prioritize indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. Now I will introduce to you our speaker for today and give you some logistical information about this presentation. All right, well, today I'm delighted to welcome Eric Nost to our DEIJ seminar series. For all of you joining us for this webinar, please feel free to add questions you may have at any time during the talk through the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. And then after the presentation, we'll have a moderated Q&A section. And so then we'll kind of go over all those questions at the end. And now to introduce you to Eric Nost. So a key challenge for researchers in assessing data technologies promises to help society solve sustainability issues related to species habitat and ecosystem services conservation. Taking on this challenge, Eric's research focuses in particular on understanding technology's human dimensions, that is its design, use, maintenance, and consequences. He is interested in how environmental data systems come to be and also experimenting with them towards just and equitable ends. Eric Nost is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. He teaches undergraduate courses in nature, society, geography, and mapping, as well as graduate courses in the Masters in Conservation Leadership program. Eric is also a co-coordinator of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative's Environmental Enforcement Watch, the EEW, which brings people together to analyze publicly available socio-environmental data. All right, Eric, well, we're really excited to have you with us, and I'm going to just leave it to you. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone, the coordinating or the committee for this really important and exciting set of talks that we've had over the past few weeks and in previous years as well. I'm really honored to be a part of this series, and I'm really appreciative of the speakers who have come before me. And so hopefully I'll be able to add a little bit to that conversation. I know I've certainly learned a lot from them. And in fact, I do collaborate very closely with Dr. Lourdes Vera, who we heard from a few weeks ago. And so I hope to actually interweave some of what I'll be sharing with what we may have heard from and learned from her a few weeks ago. So I would also like to start by acknowledging that, yes, I'm assistant professor of geography here at the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics, the University of Guelph. So I'm speaking to you today from Guelph, Ontario, Canada, which is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the traditional territories of other Anishinaabe peoples, as well as Haudenosaunee. And This also happens to be dish with one spoon covenant territory land, and that is an agreement that predates settlement and colonization amongst the peoples of this place to equitably sustain and share the resources of the place. And it's an agreement that we are bound to today, even if, and that we need to honor. And I think it's also important to make this acknowledgement because of the kinds of technologies that and systems that we've been talking about over the past few weeks in this series, and that I'll talk about today, have roots in, the kinds of geospatial technologies, have roots and applications that have resulted in the dispossession of indigenous lands. And we obviously need to ensure that those technologies do not simply repeat those processes. And so, things like indigenous data sovereignty and care principles are really important in that, as we've heard, and as we'll talk a little bit about today. So where am I going to go today? Well, I'll start by just giving an introduction to some of the issues that I think a lot about and work on. So I'll start with introducing this idea of digital conservation and some of the responses to it in the form of conservation, data justice, move into brief overview in terms of the datafication of environmental justice and responses to that in the form of environmental data justice. I'll arrive at the point or the argument that I hope to make, or at least sort of what I'm thinking about those things. I'll then dive into just a brief overview of my work in the areas of digital conservation and environmental justice. But really, the main part of the talk today will be exploring some key themes that I've identified as cross-cutting between conservation data justice and environmental data justice, specifically gaps, precision, and prioritization. Now, the talk of my presentation includes embodiment. I've included it here, but I've struck it through, not because I don't think that's very important. I think it's paramount, considering the embodied, the forms of embodiment that data might express, or how data embody certain relationships with the land. But given that we had an excellent presentation from Dr. Vera on this a few weeks ago, I've decided, and in the interest of time, I've decided to not really dive into that, but happy to try to say more of that in the Q&A if need be. And then at the end, I'll explore some ways forward in terms of how we might think about these themes. So going from gaps to context, precision to care, and from prioritization to abundance. Okay, so digital conservation. So the way that I think about this is, of course, new kinds of and emerging kinds of digital technologies, but also related relationships, ideas, practices that aim to make conservation more effective and perhaps more just through the intensified datafication of genes, individuals, species, habitats, in the algorithmic or automated analysis of that data. And specifically, digital conservation is seen as offering up a set of promises. And the ones I've listed here are the ones that I think a lot about. You might be able to think of some on your own, in your own work experience. First, the promise of filling information gaps. So, some examples that we might think of there might include wildlife cameras, you see here on the image on the left, or environmental DNA, eDNA on the right, which might provide evidence for us of rare species that might not be detectable otherwise. Or we might think of Instagram posts that could reveal to us cultural ecosystem services or landscape values that we might not otherwise be able to measure. So filling those information gaps. Digital conservation also promises to do this more precisely, so offering a more fine-grained view of different phenomena. So that might be eBird data from citizen scientists that helps us understand the timing and location of bird migration routes in the Central Pacific Flyway, let's say. That might be Chesapeake Bay Conservancy and what they call micro-targeting of incentives to specific landowners based on attributes we might have about them from various big data sources. Digital conservation promises more of a holistic approach, so connecting a wider variety of data sources, so not just environmental DNA, but that alongside, say, drone imagery, to understand species ecology interactions, species environment interactions. It promises perhaps to do all this more cheaply if it means getting citizen scientists to volunteer their data or turning towards machines and sensors to replace field surveys, and also to do conservation perhaps more democratically. So as Microsoft puts it, to perhaps democratize artificial intelligence through programs like AI for Earth, giving conservation organizations that might be under resourced more ability to make sense of the world and do their work. Now, of course, there's challenges to all this, right? Cost is one of those. The sensors can be very costly. Getting eDNA sequence can be costly. There's also expertise involved, right? This requires expertise to curate data, to process the data, to analyze the data that we pull out, whether the data, and then finally there's questions, of course, around data quality and reliability, right? Whether the data are actually research grade, or even data that we might collect on species and habitats that could be used or considered usable for regulatory or planning context. That's a key question or a challenge here, is whether some of this data that we might get from citizen science sources, for instance, would fit that bill. So in the context of this digitalization and datafication, scholars have begun thinking about conservation data justice. And these researchers go beyond just examining what data-driven conservation science means in terms of rigor and quality and explainability, all that, yes, but also to think about the political, social, and economic context of data as it meets conservation. And so, for instance, we see a lot of these different, just a few handful that I pulled out here of the papers working on this in the past year or two. On the left, on the right, some specific points pulled out of these papers and others. So for instance, Sarkar and Chapman write about the effects of datafication on communities whom conservation scientists work with in global south or majority world contexts. So, if acoustic sensors and camera traps and so on are doing the data collection, Sarkar and Chapman write, well, that might actually put, for instance, community members out of work, those who would have previously done data collection, and that might actually decrease community buy-in to the conservation effort or initiative, and perhaps endanger its success. Elsewhere, Shen et al. Write about environmental DNA, and in conversations about its applicability within conservation, conservation's relative lack of success to date is framed as a data problem. So we don't know where species are because, we don't have enough data. So how can we protect them? More data through eDNA might be the answer. And so Shen et al. Question that focus on whether conservation really is limited by technology and not other issues like funding and politics and all that. And finally, authors are asking about some of the epistemological dimensions of digital conservation. So not just, is this right, but whose knowledge does this reflect? So they note systematic exclusions or even warped inclusions of embodied local community and/or indigenous knowledge and conservation historically, which may only be made more worse by costly and difficult to operate tools, perhaps in spite of this rhetoric around democratization. And some of the specific harms here include like a lack of consent to data extraction, disregard for human and non-human privacy, biases towards specific people, places, and species. So Chapman et al. Write that new waves of biodiversity data that we might find at, on GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, have entrenched the long-known overrepresentation of certain regions, taxa, and time periods in global biodiversity repositories. And they make the point that, the data that we collect is always going to be shaped by social, political, and economic context. And even, responses to that, to create more data by datafying more things, can actually create another layer of bias, as they write, between the social, political, and cultural dimensions of data that are easy to digitize and those that aren't. At the same time, environmental data science has turned its attention towards addressing environmental racism. And of course, as many have noted, generating the kinds of data to document environmental harms is something that's been a goal and something that's been a part of the environmental justice movement for quite some time. But community activists, university researchers, NGO staff, community science, or government scientists, are turning to new forms of data and analysis to advance environmental justice right now. So that would include things like lower cost air quality sensors, such as those made available by Purple Air. We see that on the right there. It might be environmental justice from space. A lot of interesting things being done and written about there right now, where we have agencies like NASA trying to make some of its satellite remote sensing products meaningful and accessible to communities who want to understand disparate exposures to air pollutants or temperatures. And so some of the promises here of environmental or data for environmental justice are very similar to those for digital conservation, right? To fill gaps, through perhaps more widespread satellite-based observations, to do so more precisely, perhaps through air quality monitors that are more widely distributed and able to give continuous real-time fence line monitoring next to polluting facilities, to do so holistically, so compiling data across environmental, epidemiological, and sociological domains towards understanding cumulative impacts and not just one or two things in isolation. Obviously, to address environmental racism and promote environmental justice perhaps more cheaply and more cost effectively for communities through sensors like the Purple Air, but also perhaps machine learning of state data regarding polluters to identify where those public agencies can prioritize inspections, given the budget cuts those agencies face. And democratization. So, again, opening up data to communities. Now, the challenges here are also very similar in the sense of, there's still cost involved to some of this data. There's expertise questions in terms of to what extent can communities work with, say, NASA's remote sensing products? There's questions around data quality and reliability, right? So do Purple Air quality monitors count for official purposes? And so, recognizing some of these tensions in environmental data, the fact that, data on pollution, for instance, can be powerful in addressing some of the harms communities have faced, while also recognizing that data centricity, centering data in and of itself can also be harmful in that it places, sometimes unachievable burdens of proof on communities. This notion of environmental data justice, developed by many of the folks you see listed as authors on papers here, Dr. Vera, who we heard from a couple weeks ago, notably amongst them. Environmental data justice steps in to navigate these tensions. And so, a definition of environmental data justice here would come from Dillon et al. In 2017, top paper there, who write, quote, beginning with community-based environmental data collection, public, especially online accessibility of environmental data, and environmental data platforms supported by an open source online infrastructure, in particular, one that can be used and modified by local communities. In addition, they go on to write about how environmental data justice can be an opportunity to think about sort of what injustices data practices may support or reinforce. And so, at the intersection of these two things, there are, I think some interesting conversations. I mean, to date, conservation data justice and environmental data justice have mostly not directly engaged one another, with some very important exceptions. So some of the papers that we've seen so far, as well as some of the presentations we've seen in this series so far, like Dr. Vera's. Also, there's this symposium happening right now in Spain that some folks might actually be on this seminar, on this webinar, listening into, and they're working at this intersection of conservation and environmental data justice. So these conversations are definitely happening, but I do think that a direct engagement between them can really help clarify some of the shared concerns. And so from my perspective, I think there's some common interlocking themes between these two things. So first, a concern for these gaps in data, care around precision and the preciseness of data and analysis, caution about prioritization, or the ends to which we use some of this data, and also recognition of the important role of embodiment in data practices and analysis. And I want to make clear that, we'll go through each of these themes. They're not solely the sort of bad things that we might critique about the datafication of conservation or environmental justice. There's a lot of ambiguity in these themes in terms of, like, it's not just that precision is harmful and so we should be wary of it. So stay tuned for that. What I'm going to do is I'll proceed through each theme and discuss some examples from practical experiments that I've been engaged with, and ultimately discuss some potential ways forward. Now, if I didn't make clear, the image on the right there is where the symposium in Spain is happening, where we have folks really talking across and together about some of these intersections between environmental data justice as it's being developed, as well as data justice and conservation. So just a little bit briefly about what I've been working on here. In terms of digital conservation, a survey that I launched, a couple of surveys that I launched a few years ago. So just surveying the landscape of the conversation about digital conservation. So these, I looked at websites linked to from tweets that mentioned keywords in the digital conservation sphere, like artificial intelligence or drones. I counted keywords on those websites, and this is just a very basic keyword count and chart over time. So the takeaway here is that we see increasing discussion of artificial intelligence, relative decrease in conversation around drones, though still in an absolute sense very much in the conversation. A survey I did of about 45 medium and small-sized conservation organizations throughout North America. The analysis here is still ongoing, but I wanted to know a little bit more about whether digital conservation is really democratizing, and which has a lot to do with capacity and how organizations are able to access that tool, whether it's through partners or in-house capacity or outsourcing that through contracts. And so there's a lot of accessing these tools through partners, as well as outsourcing it, but a lot of in-source development as well. A lot of figures here, but the main takeaway is that organizations that I surveyed seem pretty satisfied with their use of different forms of big data, meeting their goals in terms of real-time monitoring and accessing a wider range of data, whereas those fewer organizations that had attempted to use various forms of artificial intelligence, maybe it actually weren't as satisfied in terms of meeting some of those specific outcomes or goals. I also do a number of experiments in digital conservation as a way to understand more concretely and in a more hands-on way some of the opportunities and limitations of digital conservation. So, each of the maps that we're seeing here draws on volunteer geographic information sources like eBird, iNaturalist, to see what's possible, right? So the first on the left there is a suitability analysis for conservation efforts in my watershed here. where I live, that, what that might look like if beyond just the kind of typical inputs to suitability analysis, we included eBird or iNaturalist observations. The second in the middle there is more zoomed in analysis for the city of Guelph, trying to identify informal green spaces or places where people are recreating based on where we see them making eBird or iNaturalist observations, but that aren't formal parks. And the third that we see there on the right is an attempt to extend Ontario's the provincial authorities where they recognize species range as. And so this is the bald eagle, and the pink squares there are where the province recognized bald eagles to probably occur or to be found. The other squares are where, based on eBird or iNaturalist observations, we might also say, hey, we're finding bald eagles here. In terms of work with environmental data justice, this stems a lot from my collaboration in the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative and our Environmental Enforcement Watch project, which we learned a little bit about from Dr. Vera a few weeks ago. Our goal is to make publicly available data on industry compliance with and state enforcement of environmental protection laws like the Clean Water Act, making that data more widely accessible and meaningful. So one thing we've done is make report cards for each congressional district and state in the country, in the US, to show how that district fares when it comes to like the Clean Water Act. Are inspections of water polluters being done? How many violations are those polluters racking up? An example there on the left. The report cards, they're supported by a variety of data science tools we developed and run with journalists, advocacy orgs, researchers in order to go beyond what the EPA makes easy to access and see. So for instance, one of the things we do is we make it possible to see what's happening in a watershed, not just in a zip code or any sort of administrative boundary, which the EPA tends to rely upon. The notebooks are frankly kind of wonky, right? So we also have built dashboards that we've utilized in classrooms to engage students in environmental justice questions, as well as questions about the data behind environmental justice analyses themselves. And this is one example for looking at Safe Drinking Water Act in New Jersey. Okay, so some key themes that I want to explore that I see cross-cutting conservation and environmental data justice. And the first here is that of gaps in our data and in our understanding of phenomena. And the big motivating question here really is, well, when does more data equate to the outcomes we're interested in, which might be care and justice? And when is more data actually perhaps a distraction? So we live in a big data era that presumes that we have an abundance of data, or that it is possible to acquire an abundance of data. But as I'm sure many of us have recognized in our own projects, inevitably there are some sort of data that are missing. And we know that that means missing certain people, places, species, habitats, whatever it might be. And so we definitely want to try to fill those gaps and make connections between those things. There's definitely that impulse. But what I want to emphasize here and caution about, based on the experience I've had working at the intersection of conservation and environmental data justice, is this notion of data treadmills. And in this, I'm turning towards Nick Shapiro and co-authors, Jenny Goldstein, who write about this tendency where, acquiring more data reveals more uncertainties in the phenomenon that we're researching, or about the data themselves, which leads us perhaps naturally as researchers to want to collect more data. resulting over time, perhaps in this sort of treadmill effect of data, uncertainties, data, and so on and so forth, which can lead ultimately to a lack of action or perhaps this sort of situation where the data isn't translating into whatever we want it to, policy, whatever it might be. And so some specific examples of where I see this and how it plays out, some of the work that I've done. On the one hand, new data sources are seen to fill those previously existing gaps. So, eBird or iNaturalist might fill in empirical observations across a wider geographical range, or environmental justice, fence line monitoring definitely fills in a gap of understanding where usually we just have industry's own estimates of pollution to rely upon. As citizen scientists collect more species data to fill in those gaps, frontline communities are collecting more pollution data. There's more purple air monitors out there than government public agency air monitors by quite a bit. And those purple air monitors, as we've done some analysis in EDJ, are actually closer to regulated facilities and more responsive, perhaps, to those facilities than the public agency ones. On the other hand, we acknowledge that gaps continue to exist even as these new data sources fill them, right? So, we might perhaps need even more data, right? We still haven't recorded every species everywhere. And what we see here on the left is an example from iNaturalist where it's, although some modeling has been done to synthetically fill in the gaps in iNaturalist data, there's also this really neat tool which will tell you, you're in your community, you've observed this many species. Really, in this particular part of your community, you've only observed this many. There's a gap to fill here. And the reason why these gaps matter, right, just to make this clear, is that it means that perhaps some species aren't being recognized in conservation planning, or perhaps when it comes to environmental justice, those data gaps, which are often biased along racialized lines, where we have more data in whiter communities compared to racialized communities, minoritized communities, that might lead to those communities with less data not being recognized in screening tools that allocate funding around environmental justice. And we know, just looking at some of the numbers here, we know that the Biden administration, what they consider disadvantaged tracts, actually are slightly less likely to have air monitors, even purple air monitors. And so, the problem here in this theme around gaps is simply, well, will more data actually lead to the problem being addressed? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And I don't have a necessarily straightforward answer in all cases, right, for you today. But we do know that even while filling gaps is key, and at EDJ we aim to do that, we do want to remain aware of not chasing data and getting on that treadmill. Another key theme here is precision, right? So the motivating question here is, when is more detail care and justice? When does it equate to more care and justice? And when is it not? So data is not, in this big data era, it's not just about more data, right? It's about more temporally and spatially precise data. And that might, for example, look like alongside different kinds of artificial intelligence techniques, that might look like something like counting individual trees, which is what this study from a few years ago did for the Sahel in the Western Sahara. And another example, again, might be the fence line monitoring. And this may miss context. The more we zoom in, perhaps the less we see, the more we become fascinated with precision itself. Measuring more precisely is not always care. An important question here is what circumstances it might be considered care. when would the relation that we want to measure actually want precision? Like which individual plants, animals, people, places would want to be measured more precisely is, I think, an important question. In the Sahel case, I'll note, it actually led to a kind of new story in the sense that the authors counting those individual trees found that actually desertification, which was widely held to be a severe problem there in this kind of big narrative about how the entire region was converting to desert, it actually maybe not as widespread as thought. Now, political ecologists maybe had known that for a long time without individually counting trees, but nonetheless, an important another piece of evidence for that. So precision, definitely has its importance, but it's maybe not always care, right? It can be a kind of fetish, more precise for more precision's sake, or in some cases, depending on the motivations of whoever is trying to measure more precisely, a kind of perhaps stall tactic. So just a couple key examples here. I'll actually focus on the one on the right here, related to the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative to allocate funding from the Inflation Reduction Act to what it labels as disadvantaged communities across the US. And this is measured at the census tract level. But as journalists actually found out in some of their analysis of this data, if you look more precisely at the census block group level, you'll find that what is happening is that in some census tracts not labeled as disadvantaged, you will find census block groups that would actually meet the threshold for disadvantagedness. And so in this case, this is where precision actually provides an important sense of care. The final theme that I want to touch on here is around prioritization. And so the motivating question here is, when does ranking, employing datafication of in conservation and environmental justice work towards ranking, when does that demonstrate care and justice? And we know that data is being used to prioritize interventions, be it in 30 by 30 efforts, set aside 30% of the world's surface in conservation protection by 2030. We see this in environmental justice work in the Inflation Reduction Act that I just described. And this is a kind of means testing for places and habitats, and when done well, that can mean that precious monies go to where they're truly needed. But in practice, prioritization can compound a lot of the data problems and harms that we've just discussed. So, we rank habitats and communities based on data that are incomplete and skewed, like we're reinforcing those biases in the data. And prioritization can also miss addressing root causes insofar as it emphasizes accounting for existing damage or potential opportunity. In that way, it can really perpetuate harm-oriented representations of people, places, and species. It also misses opportunities to connect communities in terms of these root causes. So connecting the places that share similar drivers of habitat loss or pollution. In many ways, prioritization pits communities against one another for these scarce monies. So some examples here of like what happens when we try to prioritize with gappy data. Well, some true priorities might be missed. So on the left here, looking at prioritizing species habitat. Well, when we do that based on data that aren't complete, that might reflect limited best professional judgment, then we might be missing out on places where we actually do have true habitats, true species observations. Maybe we just don't have the evidence for. So that example of the missing bald eagle habitat. Example on the right, again, the Justice 40 initiative. The climate and economic justice screening tool that prioritized where these monies should go. It considered many factors, except the one that has been shown consistently to most equate to environmental marginalization, which is race. It also did include things like enforcement of environmental protection laws. And we know that if the state isn't enforcing the rules that it has on its books, well, that could certainly make a community disadvantaged. And so in some of the analysis EDJ did, we looked at, well, what if we do include environmental enforcement in the prioritization of communities? And we actually ended up suggesting that more communities could be added as deserving of IRA funding if we included that factor. But what we see here is just a list of the industry sectors that were common to places named as disadvantaged by the Justice 40 initiative. So some ways forward that I'll share briefly, given that we are nearly at time now, and there's obviously going to be more time to, I'm happy to discuss any of this at any point if we do run out of time in the Q&A today. But just to note here briefly that what I'm proposing here is potential ways forward. It's just from my own experience alongside collaborators. We could point to many other examples here. And here I've just mentioned or listed two inspirations, and I'm sure I could put many more on here. And I'm sure you all have your own that you can think of. But for me, I'd like to see a move from thinking solely just in terms of data gaps to thinking about context, right? So we've already talked about trying to avoid the data treadmill. Well, how do we do that? We have some principles, right, in mind in terms of like filling gaps where necessary, but aiming for what Jennifer Gabrys and Helen Pritchard describe as just good enough data. And the guiding question there really is, well, what is the context for the data? It's for regulatory analysis. Well, what counts as just good enough for that context? I think it's also important to study the gaps themselves. So to highlight, well, what is it about those gaps that is causing them to be gappy, which is some of what we've done in EDJ. We can move from precision to care. So care for data might mean more attention to its context rather than drilling down more into specific data values. Now, sometimes precision is care because preciseness is relational, right? Being more precise can mean greater representation, more recognition. Concretely here, we can imagine instead of trying to measure soil carbon at a 1 square meter resolution or with more certainty, with a narrow range of estimates, we might widen the investigation out, maybe have some additional variables, not to mention sort of include the wider context of the data collection and analysis itself. So we might, via the care principles that we've heard about in this series so far, think about whether that precision, that extra precision that we might seek, would really expand Indigenous specific nations' capacities, minimize harm and maximize benefit to them, and in general, think about what that extra precision or level of detail would achieve. I'd also note here, just to echo what we heard from Dr. Varick a few weeks ago in terms of care, again, the organization of how we work with data and thinking more explicitly about the kinds of care it takes to move data along and through this circuit of production, analysis, sharing, and all that. And finally, from prioritization to abundance. And so here I'm really motivated by the idea of studying connections between places rather than ranking them. And not just prioritizing, but getting at the roots of issues rather than working within the status quo where funding is scarce. And so a couple, just quickly, some examples here of what we've tried to do along these lines. This is an attempt to use k-means clustering to look at the different kinds of communities, census tracts in particular, that exist based on EPA's EJ screen and some of the variables within that. So not just ranking, community X is most disadvantaged. This community is number 2, but identifying the different kinds of communities that exist as a way of connecting them and maybe perhaps targeting some of the interventions there. And we've also worked with Global Fishing Watch data to not just look at fishing issues, global fishing issues in terms of flag, country that vessels are flying, but actually some of the drivers here in terms of the keystone actors, corporations, that drive exploitation of fishery resources. Finding that one particular company here, at least in this particular part of the Pacific Ocean, could be said to be the 4th largest fisher relative to looking at it in terms of nation states. And finally, in EDJ, we've tried to summarize greenhouse gas emissions, not just in terms of individual facilities or factories, but by company. And we have some data science tools there in that vein. We've also done it by university. And so what I'll leave you on is this idea that these 2 domains that we talked about, conservation and environmental data justice, they don't try to resolve any of the tensions and gaps and prioritization and precision that we talked about. I think they really try to sit with these tensions, navigate them critically and productively, simultaneously, rather than seeing them as something that we can resolve fundamentally forever. And so with that, I'm a little over time, I apologize, but I do think we still have some time for the Q&A. So I know there's one already in the Q&A feature.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. My name's Amelia, and I'm the Science and Policy Communications Officer at NCEAS, and I'll be moderating the Q&A today. You're right, we do have one question in the chat. I want to give a chance for other attendees to add their questions to the Q&A section, but we can get started with this question. This attendee is asking, where on the ground can you identify environmental justice in specific communities or landscapes? What are the biggest threats to environmental justice, and do you have any insights? And I'll just add that maybe you can speak to environmental data justice specifically, since environmental justice is such a huge topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. And I'll try to address it the best that I can. And if I'm not really getting at what you were hoping for, just let me know and we'll go from there, and it'll be a conversation. So in terms of identifying, environmental, on the ground and, thinking about environmental justice in specific communities or landscapes and some of the biggest threats to environmental justice, well, I guess I just sort of maybe start with the second part of the question and meander my way through it in terms of, well, I think so in terms of the threats to environmental justice, right? I mean, we're thinking here about polluters that are allowed in our permission to pollute system to continue to toxify environments in which people depend on for clean air, clean water, and other means of living, right? And so fundamentally, when we're talking about environmental justice and threats to it, if we're talking about environmental injustices and harms, right, we're talking about systems that perpetuate the ability of, or the ability of these polluters to continue to do what they do. And so, I mentioned this term, the permission to pollute system. If you're not familiar with, Max Lieberman's work, I suggest checking it out. Max talks about, this permission to pollute system in which the way that we, in at least the US and Canada, think about toxicity involves this kind of these threshold concepts where perhaps at low level concentrations of pollutants in the environment, those are not a threat to environment or public health. It's only when they meet a certain threshold that they become something that we should be concerned about. Some people even think that low levels of pollution can be, beneficial to human and environmental health. And so this threshold idea then translates in practice and in policy to permitting systems, right? So industrial facilities are permitted to release like technically banned substances so long as they do so only at a certain permitted level, right, and not above that. And so, and that is, apart from so-called accidents and whatever, that is how we end up with, environmental contamination, right? And there's more to that logic in terms of colonialism that we could get into. Again, Max Lieberman's work is really great here, but and so, that in terms of the threat, I think is what I identified. And so where does data play into that? Well, what we at EDJ sort of think of here is, data is not simply incidental to that system. Data and the infrastructures we have around environmental pollution, the data infrastructures we have around environmental pollution, is what allows, in part, that system to persist, right? Because we have this environmental data infrastructure that is plagued with gaps that allows industry to self-report how much it's putting out into the air and the water. It allows industry to model and estimate how much it's releasing. And it burdens communities on the ground, right, with having to prove that the facility has, exposed them to carcinogens and damaged their health. So it's that data infrastructure, the way that it's been set up, that enables this continuation of permission to pollute system, and where polluters can still, as long as they're within this permitted level, continue on. So, in terms of what are the biggest threats to environmental justice, I'd start there and connect it to data in terms of the sort of way we've organized the data infrastructure to assess whether industry is in compliance with its permit and some of the limitations of that. And in terms of where on the ground we're talking about, communities across North America, in particular racialized low-income communities, is where we're seeing environmental injustices, right? And we know this from 40 years worth of and more worth of community work advancing the evidence behind this, right? Yeah, thank you for that question again. Happy to follow up. Yeah.
Thank you. That was it was quite a big question, and I think you took it in a lot of very interesting places. It's definitely a lot of work to start with, just looking at pollution. If I think we have time for one more question, perhaps. And I'd like to ask about you talked a lot about the pros and cons of different data collection techniques, emphasizing that data collection itself is an opportunity to promote justice, but that there's other challenges or drawbacks related to the quality of the data, the reliability of the data. And so I'm wondering if you have recommendations for data scientists in the audience for how to strike a balance between those two things for standardized remote sensing and community engagement.
And sorry, if you could, that was a wonderful question, and I just want to make sure that I'm getting it right. So in terms of the two things, we're talking about some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges, and maybe in particular, questions around quality and reliability. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, some principles there in terms of striking a balance between those opportunities and some of the challenges, perhaps in particular around quality and reliability. I'm where to start? I'd say that, for me, a lot of the answer comes back to context, and I guess this is the frustrating moment where we have social scientists saying things like it depends, but I really do think that it depends on the context in which the data are being collected and or being analyzed for, right? And so when we start framing the question or our answer that way, then I think a lot of specific principles follow from that. So like we've seen in this speaker series so far, I think I'd point to principles like fair and care in terms of assessing and navigating some of the like opportunities versus potential challenges or harms from data collection or use. I'd also point to one of the ones that I mentioned towards the end of the talk there in terms of just good enough data. So I think I'd recognize that as it's not a formal principle, it's not a codified data science principle per se or a standard, but I think the kinds of questions that the idea of just good enough data raise in terms of like what is the purpose to which the data collection or use being put, and what is the quality needed for that purpose? What is the reliability needed for that purpose? I think that's helpful because it means that we don't necessarily, if we're thinking about analysis for a research context, that might be different in some cases from what's needed in terms of quality and reliability for a regulatory purposes. On the other hand, in some regulatory purposes, we start thinking about liability, and maybe that increases the kind of quality and reliability we need. It really just depends on that specific context. So as very general principles, I think I'd point people to maybe look into that question of just good enough data. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for addressing that question. And it's what I'm hearing from you is that if we're careful in our approach and thoughtful and kind of taking these principles into each project, we might be able to be a little more successful in that. So thank you.
Thank you.
We're just about at the top of the hour, so I guess we'll begin to wrap up this webinar. But again, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining, for saving some time in your day to learn and listen with us. And thank you for joining the NC's DEIJ seminar series. We're happy to have you, and we'll see you again next year.
Thank you all so much.